Gee, I forgot to start the recording on this thing. So those of you who are already here, you're blessed. I won't be able to repeat all that she has said before. For those who, anyway, I've begun it now. And for, oh, there's Tess Carl, who doesn't want to, okay. Let me go back to my questions. Let's see. No, wait, Marcia had a question. She wants you to describe, if you can, your revision process.
Excellent question. Well, again, over time, that too has morphed. I used to be really meticulous, and it was really hard, and it was an enormous struggle. And I'd say, okay, and I would number the drafts, draft 1, draft 2, and then I just said, well, the heck with it, because if I'm changing a verb or I'm moving a comma, does that count as a revision or not? So now it's an organic, ongoing process. I'm just always looking at it as I go. Is this making sense? I tend to write, and then I cast my mind back and pull everything up to the current point, making sure it's all fitting. So in terms of process, to be specific, if I can, it sounds simple. It's just looking, is it all hanging together? Where is it falling down? What are the holes in it? Did I miss something here? And just holding all that information in my mind as I'm going forward. For example, I just recently in the novel that I'm currently finishing up, I said, oh no, wait, I said this guy had blue eyes, and before I said he had brown. That's not going to work. So, that kind of thing. Picking up the little obvious things that a reader's going to say, oops, she wasn't paying attention here.
Okay, all right. And Ray has one more question, then I'm going to go to mine. How often have you disagreed with a publisher or editor on a point you consider important? And how does that process work? Do they win? Do you fight for something you think is important?
I fight for what I think is important, absolutely. It doesn't happen very often. I have found in general that editors and publishers are very respectful of my decisions. And I think by default they would be, because if they're going to accept the piece, then they're accepting the entire thing. Usually it's grammar and word choice that we get into, but there have been times when I've said, no, this character needs to be thinking this in this moment, and I'm standing by it, and they will let me do it. They're not going to say, oh, well, we're pulling the contract because you're not going to do what we want. But yeah, I have had to stand up and say, no, this was my word choice. I vetted it myself. I'm not letting go of this. But on the other hand, things that I can identify, and if I ask myself, is their suggestion going to make the story better? And if it will, then I'll go with it, because that's really what matters to me, is the story improved? It's not my territory, their territory, it's the story.
Right. Okay. Now, let's see. I know you lived for 8 months in Paris when you were 6.
Mm-hmm.
Did that have any effects on you?
Well, sure. I mean, living in another country, I think the main way that it affected me was I became fluent in French. And I've read that, young children have a good ear. They pick up language quickly. But I found after that, I was fascinated, by language and the differences in the rhythm of a sentence or a paragraph, and how people speak, and just the sounds of the words. So this sort of did become an obsession, being bilingual and realizing I would dream in French, or I would think a problem through in French. Yeah, I think that living abroad and learning another language really did affect me.
Are you still fluent in French?
No, I would not like to test that. I think I'd have to be dropped down on the streets of Paris again for about a month, and then it would come back.
Yeah.
But
okay. Now, I know your mother was Armenian, and her parents met and married in Constantinople before
that's correct.
To the U.S. Have you ever explored your lineage on that side, either in fiction or through travel?
Well, I did write about their relationship in my first novel, What Is Found, What Is Lost, and I fictionalized a lot of it. The part that was true was that my grandfather was Swiss, and he was teaching at the American University there, and my grandmother, who was Armenian and was born in Malta but grew up in Constantinople, was a secretary in the department he was teaching at. I think it was French. No, on that side of the family, not so much. My daughter has recently become obsessed with our family genealogy, and she's all over ancestry.com. But most of what she's doing is my dad's family, because apparently the Parrishes showed up in the United States in 1655 in Maryland. So she's got lots of material there, but I think ultimately she does want to go back. So I'm going to leave that delving to her. She's 26. It's a good project for her.
That's true. That's true. Okay. We have a question from Leslie.
Hello, Leslie.
Allie, yeah. How do you stay consistent with the personality of a character? Is it intuitive, or do you keep notes on each character as you develop a novel? I know some people, they swear by having a character Bible where they really flesh out every character. Do you do anything like that, or is it?
No, but the key word of that question is consistency. This character, any character, has to behave consistently. If they do something out of character, there has to be a big support for that. And by support, I mean I have to have made my case. The reader has to understand that this is something that the character is capable of doing, and it's going to make sense. There's a trauma in the past, or there's been a discussion in the book that's going to make it plausible for this character to depart from herself and do something that we're not expecting her to do. But then ultimately it's going to make sense. So yeah, consistency in a character is really, really important to me. And if that character is going to, break stride with herself, you have to make your case and establish a precedent for that it's going to be okay. Otherwise, she's just nuts. And character can be nuts, but I don't know that it makes the best reading.
All right. I know you played classical piano for a number of years. Mm-hmm. You've done a lot of different things. I can't imagine. You play classical piano. You were a maid. You car mechanic. Anyway. What comparisons can you make between your writing and your performance of or appreciation for music?
I would say the appreciation. I didn't do that much performing, thank goodness, because it's really nerve-wracking to get up and play for people. Classical music, a sonata has a shape, it has a rhythm, it has a whole nuance unto itself, and I really found that fiction did too. Poetry does too. There are parallels here, and the discipline of trying to understand that, what the composer was trying to do, really has helped me in my own writing. I was very dedicated in my early years. In the summers, I would practice 6 hours a day. It'd drive my family nuts. But it's that same sort of staying on top of it until it makes sense to you that I learned at the keyboard. Absolutely.
Is it the same with a novel? It has to come to a point, or does it make sense to you from the beginning?
You have to build it until it makes sense to you, because it doesn't in the beginning. When you first sit down to write, nothing is going to make sense to you in the beginning. You have to stay at it and keep building it, and then you've got to get it to that balance where it can really hang on its own, and it takes on its own life. That's what you're doing. You're giving any project its own life apart from you.
Okay, how on earth, here's something else you were. Did you evolve from being an economist to a writer of fiction?
Okay, well, here's the deal. When I started college, my dad was an English professor. My sister had majored in English when she went to college. And as drawn as I was to that, I was like, I'm not going to follow in anybody else's footsteps. I'm going to do my own thing. I was very tempted to major in history, but again, humanities. I wanted to be different. So I thought, what's useful? How can I earn a living? So I studied economics. I found that interesting. It wasn't great, but it has it's a subject. It's got a lot of meat to it. You can really get into it. And then after that, when I got my master's in business administration, again, I was studying economics. There was that historical overlay too, because we did a lot of reading, background reading. And I started working as a consultant, and I just realized, this is not what I want to do. I knew in college that I wanted to write, but I just didn't know how I was going to do that. So My husband was in law school, got his law degree. He worked in public defense for a couple of years. And then when he got out of that and went into private practice, I sat him down and I said, how would you feel if I just sort of bailed on this whole, earning a living thing and let you do that so that I can do this? And he said, yeah, sure. Fortunately, that was before we had children, so it wasn't a huge hit. That came later. I was the main child rearer later because he was going up the ladder in his career, but we worked it out between us.
Okay. Now, you really got your start with short stories, and you worked on that form for a lot of years before expanding to novels. They say that in a short story, a character is revealed, but in a novel, a character develops. So could you expand on that and also outline the biggest differences between the two forms, since you were working in both?
Very, very simply put, the biggest difference is space. 2,200 words, maybe up to 5,000 words in a short story. A novel, up to 80,000 words. You have room to go and really roam in a novel. And in fact, I'm going to segue here a little bit. As you say, I had written story after story after story. My first book, published in 2011, was a collection of short stories, All the Roads That Lead From Home. And I began to find that I wanted more room. I wanted to spend more time with a certain character. I wanted to put them in more situations. That's what led me into a novel, was just having more room to go down a backstory here, a situation over here, and really dig into it. In a story, to keep your reader really focused, they have to know who this character is. They don't have time to figure it out, and you don't have time in 2,200 words or 5,000 words, to gradually reveal what's going on with them and have them, develop and come on the scene, gradually. You have to be efficient in a short story. In a novel, you can do that. You have the luxury of time to, give one little piece of it and then another little piece of this person. So the reader is observing this character developing over time. As the character is discovering things about herself, that's where that development and growth is coming in. It's space, just words, pages, numbers of pages.
By the way, I can see you now.
Yay! What happened?
I don't know, but the other one is still on. And so when you talk, I see the black with your name, but I
see that too.
Yeah. Maybe, okay.
Oh well.
Maybe I'll put this in gallery. There you are. Okay. All right. What does your relationship with your mother have to do with your inclination to write women's fiction?
That's an interesting question. I'm going to be very honest. My mother was a difficult person. She was very conflicted in her own life. I don't think she really wanted to be married, and I don't think she wanted to be a parent either. I think she did what was expected of her. She was a professor. She later went on and was active in university administration at Rutgers University, fiercely independent, very much of a feminist, but she and I did not get along very well. And yet, as much as I find fault with how she raised me and her lack of interest basically in my welfare, I do have great respect for what she struggled with, particularly how she was perceived as a professional. When she was a professor at Cornell, waiting to become a full professor or wanting to become a full professor, the chairman of her department sat her down, this was in the late 1960s, and said, you need to understand, even if you do get this promotion, you are never going to earn at this institution as much money as your husband earns, and that's the way it is. Yeah. And I was flabbergasted by that, but that's the way it was. That's what women were told. And I have to assume that there is still some truth in that today. not just in the academic world, but in many worlds, we hear about the glass ceiling. But in terms of writing about women, yeah, I just find them more interesting. I don't let my husband hear you say that. Just their choices are very difficult. The whole reproductive situation, and will I have children? Will I not have children? When will I have children? Who gets to stay? So mom's sort of always there in the background, I think.
Do you identify more with your father or your mother?
My mother.
Really?
I am more like my dad in terms of temperament. I looked exactly like him, if you want to know. But no, I identify more with her. In fact, the novel I'm writing now, the work in progress, it's called An Open Door. It's about, it draws from the time that they were married, first married in 1945, and it's set in 1948 in their early years. And she was not happy in her marriage, and she felt very trapped. And that's what I'm writing about from her point of view.
Okay, for those beginning or unpublished writers who may be watching and listening, what are the advantages and disadvantages of pursuing an MFA in creative writing? And if you choose to do it, should you do it right after college or wait a while? Does it matter how old you are when you do it?
It doesn't matter how old you are. I don't think. I mean, well, okay, so here's the thing about an MFA. It's great because it gives you designated time to work on your writing. And I think for a lot of people, carving out that time is really hard. If you have a full-time job and you're trying to carve out time for writing and you have a family, it's really, really hard to do that. And I know that women authors, there's a lot of guilt because women still are predominantly the caregivers. But if you're in a program that instantly lends legitimacy to your effort, it does give you that time and space. I think there's a lot to be said for getting to know aspiring writers and getting comfortable with having other people read your work and seeing what other people are working on. It can be terrifying too. I mean, because what are they going to think? Are they going to tear my manuscript apart? And that whole workshop model is so annoying. Let's pull it apart and see if we can fix it. I'm not into that. I would say that if you want to teach creative writing, you have to get that degree. I don't know how you're going to get a teaching job without it. But in terms of the quality of work, you don't have to have it. You can learn on your own. But I think there's a lot to be said for it if you want to devote that time. And it gives one a sense of legitimacy. It tells the world, this is my career. This is what I'm doing. Mm-hmm. But you don't have to have it to get published and to move forward in it. No.
Okay. How did you make the transition from self-publishing to traditional through a small press? Yeah, you don't have an agent,
No.
But how much support do you get from your current publisher?
Okay. Well, to back up just a little bit, all of the short stories that I published, and I'm up to like 50 or 60 now, those are all traditionally published. Those were all curated by an editor at a press. That was not self-publishing at all. Technically speaking, the only thing I really have self-published, if you go to my Amazon page, you're going to see two what I call short story trios, and they are called The Magic Heart and Where Love Lies, available on Kindle Direct Publishing only. Those I self-published. I was working with a woman at the time, a publicist, who said, get these stories out there so that make them available so people can get a sense of your work and they'll want more and they'll be led to your story collection. So my first book in 2011 with Press 53, that was traditional publishing, and I'm going to just explain that term a little bit or clarify. There is a lot of junk going on in publishing right now, and terms are getting thrown around. But to me, traditional publishing means the publisher is paying to bring the book out. The author is not paying to bring the book out. When I went with She Writes Press, that was a hybrid publishing experience. I paid their publishing package. They brought out the book. They printed the book, but I had to pay for everything. Then I got to keep the bulk of the royalties. There was a royalty share structure that is different from traditional publishing, where you have 15% to the author and 85% to the publisher. She writes, it's sort of the other way around almost. But now I'm with Unsolicited Press, that, again, traditional publishing. And then there was Black Rose Writing in the middle there. That was for Women Within, also traditional publishing. I get a lot of support. They're very active on Twitter, on reaching out in their local community of Portland, Oregon, approaching book clubs. Would you be interested in reading this? Approaching libraries. Could you stock this? They work pretty hard for me, and I'm grateful. I do a lot of it too. I work with a publicist, so, you know.
They don't pay for your publicist, or do you?
No, I pay for the publicist. And that's pretty typical, I think, unless you're in a big five publishing, you know. The smaller presses really just don't have the resources to do that. So the author has to do that.
Okay.
And it can get expensive, so you have to be judicious about what you're paying for.
Can we ask how much you pay her or him? I mean,
I've paid a lot.
What would you say would be too much to pay?
I would say if you hire a publicist who's going to give you a full publicity package and they're going to send out to X places, they're going to send out 50 copies of your book to their contacts and review agencies. If that person wants to charge you more than $15,000, that's too much.
Okay. All right. All right. Oh, somehow that skipped down. All right, let's go to the Dugan Family. It's featured in your last 3 books, Our Love Could Light the World, The Amendment, and Maggie's Ruse. And
yes.
It's figure again in your next novel, A Winter Night, which is due out next April.
March. We moved it up to March 2021.
Oh, okay. Tell us about this family and what it is that compels you to keep returning to various members of it, or.
Well, okay, it's a family with 5 kids, and the parents are divorced. They're just nuts. I mean, they're not nuts. They're just, they fight a lot. They're affectionate. Just, you know, having 5 kids, all of these things can go on. And then, of course, there's a pair of identical twins. They were the subject of the novel Maggie's Ruse. The mother, Lavinia, I think she's great. She's very hard-nosed, but she's sympathetic too. She's cynical. She's blunt. She was the subject of the novel The Amendment, where her second husband is killed in a freak accident. He gets struck by lightning on a golf course. I don't mean to pat myself on the back, but I just think that's hilarious. I mean, it's not, but it is. And she just sort of gets in the car and she drives across the country because she's had it. She's had it with everything. Her kids are all grown. She's still in love with her first husband, although he's a terrible alcoholic. So she's kind of figuring, nah, that's not going to work again. I just find them interesting because they take these quirky chances. They're intelligent people. They've faced a lot of adversity, and I just like them a lot. I have great fun with them.
So does Dugan become her third husband?
Dugan is her first husband.
First husband, yeah.
Yeah, Potter Dugan was her first husband, and Chip Starkhurst is her second husband. So she's Lavinia Dugan Starkhurst.
Okay.
And she's single now. I don't think she's going to get married again. She might.
Okay. You've said you work relentlessly at your writing. Which of your novels was the most difficult to produce? Why and how many? Of course, you don't do real revisions anymore, but.
No, not too much. The first one, What is Found, What is Lost. It was exhausting. It was terrifying. I just did not know if I was going to get through that thing in one piece. It was published in October 2014, and I was working on it through most of 2013, and I was just terrified of it. And then I finally said to myself, look, is it really likely that this thing is going to just be awful? I mean, just keep at it, you know, keep at it. You'll get to the end of it, and then you'll push it, and it'll be okay. But that first one was really hard.
Okay. Carolyn wants to know if you knew anyone like Lavinia.
Yeah, I think she's like me.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not a widow, thank goodness. I've been married 43 years, but I think she's like me.
Okay. All right. Can you talk about the importance of layering in both characterization and plot, and the best ways to achieve
Mm.
successful?
Okay, well, to me, layering is another word for complexity and nuance. Uh, People are very complicated. Even people who at first impression seem simple, we're all very complicated. We have many sources of anxiety and joy. So characters have to be multi-layered. And I think the best way to achieve that in terms of a character is be realistic and be a good observer and understand somebody's psychology and motivation and fear and figure out what they want and how hard they're going to fight for it. And that makes them multi-layered because we're all inconsistent within ourselves. We're all sort of working against our best interests a lot of the time. In terms of plot, I'm not really sure how to answer that. Your plot has to make sense. You don't want it to veer off in areas that you're not going to stay with. So you don't have dropped plot threads, in other words. Keep it all moving in the same general direction. And I don't know if in doing that you are necessarily making your plot layered, but you're keeping it consistent. So it's kind of two different things. I think characters tend to be more layered than plots do.
Now you don't outline in advance, do you?
No.
No.
But
Okay.
a lot of people do. A lot of people do. I don't. I just get an idea and just keep working with it. Is it looping together? Is it hanging together?
Okay. Right. Okay. What do you think about the current state of publishing? How does it compare with the way it was when you first became published? And how has it changed for authors in particular? And what demands are we seeing today on writers that weren't there 30 years ago?
I think publishing, it's really, really hard. The big five publishers that do have the money to do a big print run and pay big advances, they are really going to be leaning on you about how well your book sells. And if your book doesn't sell, there's a chance that they're going to say to you, we're not going to have you back. And that's a problem. My current publisher, much smaller, they don't get all over me about my book sales. When I was writing short stories, obviously I wasn't thinking in terms of books at all. And when I began to publish books, I was absolutely clueless about how to market a book, how to get it to sell. I didn't even have the idea that my publisher was going to be unhappy if the sales didn't reach a certain point. I guess in my own learning curve, and to speak specifically to my experience in publishing rather than to the industry as a whole, I would say I was just really surprised by how much the author needs to do herself to get that book in front of people, hiring a publicist or sending it out for reviews, paying for reviews, entering contests. The publisher can only do so much if they're a small or a mid-sized publisher. They just don't have the money to do it. That's the thing. And you have to work hard to get your book out.
Yeah. In fact, it's fine. I find it awesome, unbelievable that these small presses can continue to exist.
It's dicey. Yeah. I know my press, they apply for grants and they're happy to accept donations. And I think every now and then they'll get a book that does sell pretty well. But they are very heavy on poetry, literary fiction, and memoir. Now, memoirs sell much better than literary fiction and poetry. But and with the slowdown, I know they've struggled when people stopped going out to bookstores. So, we're all hoping that that's going to open up again soon.
Now, you mentioned poetry, and I wanted to. You've been composing a lot more poetry lately.
Yeah.
Is it focused on women's issues like much of your fiction, or does it range more widely?
It ranges more widely. There's a lot about nature in my poetry. I lived in Seattle for 35 years, and we moved down to Olympia, Washington, and we kind of live in the middle of a forest down here. And I spent a lot of time staring at the trees And I write about that. I write about nature and rain and what are all these processes that I see going on in the forest. But yes, women's issues are there. Reproductive rights are there. Relationships. I write a lot about relationships. I don't think you can be married for 43 years and not be obsessed with relationships. I write a lot about that. I would say the poetry in terms of subject ranges much more widely than my fiction does.
Could you share a poem with us? If or not?
Oh, you put me on the spot. Hang on. Hang on. Yes, I can. Whoops. What you heard was my notebook hitting the floor. Okay, so yes, I'm going to read you a poem. It's called How They Conquer. Okay, here we go. They come to you with windows that look into the yard where the grass grows wild because no one mows it. You try until those rusty blades resist. They come to you with food, lamb or beef or something full of blood. Your mother prepares with rosemary and thyme, garlic and olive oil, so tasty you want more, and are told you've had enough. They come to you with laughter while your aunt pours herself a martini to kill the pain of being in her own skin. She'd sit there forever watching the shadows grow long, but sadly, nature calls. They slide in a new floor plan that moves the bathroom from the cellar she opens by mistake, sucks her down into darkness where the stone floor shocks her body, rattles her breath, almost snuffs her out. They rise in crisis, sirens, lights, a scream. Your mother can't manage the telephone, so you make the call. The numbers fade and the dial won't turn. It always happens like this. Even as they roll her out, she heals and loves her gin. Your mother's apron is stained again with olive oil and herbs. This is how they conquer time, by coming only in dreams. And I think my friend Leslie knows the incident on which that poem was based. My aunt fell down my cellar stairs when I was 10 years old and darn near died. She was heading off to the powder room and took a wrong turn and boom.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
I know. But she lived. She lived to 91.
Oh, good. Okay.
It was all that gin.
Now, is your father passed or is he still alive?
Yes, he died in 2012. Mm-hmm.
Well, I believe he introduced you to poetry early on. He was a Wordsworth scholar.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Is that part of the reason you think you're coming back around to poetry?
Maybe. I had always wanted to write poetry and I just was convinced that I couldn't. And I'm glad to discover that I can. All those years of getting the exact word, obsessing over words, really does help. Yeah, I wondered about that too. And I haven't quite decided, what role his interests played, but yeah, I'm glad.
Yeah.
Anything helps.
Okay, last question. Yeah. You said in an interview last year that you felt your view of life has become more objective over time. So you worry that your prose may come across as detached in a way.
Yes, and people have said to me, how can you write this crushing scene and just have the woman get up and walk away? Well, you get into your 60s and life just does not bite you the way it used to bite you. And at least, I can't speak for everyone, obviously, but I just find that I am able to become more detached. Things just don't hurt as much as they did. And I try to give my characters that. And I think younger readers in their 20s and 30s just think, my goodness, you're so cold, you're so removed. I don't know, this is what time gives us, pipe down, you'll find out, it's okay.
So my other question is, with all the events and development of this year, from the pandemic to the current protests over systemic racism, is that still the case? Are you still finding yourself detached, or are you causing to reflect
I
more?
do reflect.
Does it
I
give
don't
you
think I'm
any
detached.
ideas for future fiction?
Oh yeah, yeah. I'm thinking about writing a short story set in a nursing home. A nursing home does feature as a backdrop for a lot of my fiction, uh, based on my dad's experience in a retirement home. But last night, just in fact, I thought I'm going to write a short story about a young person who's coming to visit her grandmother, and COVID is everywhere, and she has to be screened, and she's worried, is she going to be okay? Is the nursing home going to handle it if there's an outbreak, and what that is all going to be? So yeah, that's a rare instance of a current event informing me, because I tend not to pay too much attention to the world, but you can't ignore this, really.
No. Yeah. Um, okay, there's one last question from Susan Wolf. How do you go about finding people to review your books?
That's where the publicist comes in. That person ideally is going to have a list of contacts at newspapers and magazines. And on the strength of those contacts, they may be willing, to take a look. I always buy a Kirkus review. You don't have to pay Kirkus review. Your publisher, can send that in, or you can send it in and opt, not to be paid, but there's no guarantee that they're going to do it. So if you're willing to pay their fee, again, an author paywall, then you will absolutely get a review. And there are a lot of review outlets. If you are willing to pay, they will, they'll publish a review for you. And then you have to keep your fingers crossed that it's a good one and that you're willing to publish it. They will give you the option of not publishing it if the review isn't very good.
Okay. I thought I would conclude with a couple of pages from, unless you want to read it yourself.
Well, you'll have to, I think I have it on my desk. What is it?
I had just begun reading the amendment because I couldn't wait any longer for that other book to come.
That's a great book.
I'm going to read just the first few pages from chapter 1. So, because she's already referred to it. At first, Lavinia thought Mel was joking. Mel was never not joking. That rubber snake in the freezer last Christmas during their annual open house, her husband Chip knew he'd put it there. He also knew how Lavinia felt about snakes. She didn't scream or even gasp when she discovered it, flaked with ice, lounging on a bag of frozen peas. She wanted to take it into the living room and toss it into Mel's lap. That would have served the smartass right. But she couldn't. Mel was Chip's best friend. She might have understood what Mel was trying to tell her on the telephone if his words hadn't been punctuated by sobs. She'd never known him to be a drinker, but supposed he could have started out of the blue. Some men wept when they hit the bottle, right? Potter, her ex, surely had. That was later, though, near the end of things. Back when he thought he was still secure in her affection, he'd been affable when drunk, sometimes singing as he hauled her to her feet for a quick spin around the kitchen, always when she was paying bills or going over the children's homework. He just couldn't stand to see her working, which was funny because she worked all the time, back then at least. She quickly decided that Mel was sober, that the sobs were a put on to enhance the joke. You can cut the crap, Mel. I'm hooked. I'm just standing here waiting for the punchline, she said. She'd taken the call in Chip's study. The enormous windows were crystal clear because they'd just been washed. Lavinia insisted on clean windows when the weather warmed. The winter had been brutal even for upstate New York, full of lake effect snow, and spring came late and gloriously. Then all of a sudden the trees made a wall of green. There seemed to be no glass separating her from the yard, as if she could simply put down the telephone and step over the low wooden sill and escape. But the sky was angry that day, and thunder boomed in the distance. There had been flashes of light, and Lavinia found herself wondering vaguely if Chip was enjoying his golf game despite the threat of rain. She then understood that Mel was talking about the weather too, and the storms rolling through. He wasn't making a joke. He was trying to pull himself together in order to deliver his news plainly so that Lavinia would understand. Chip was dead, struck by lightning on the 9th green. Lavinia sat down in the chair by the heavy solid desk, the chair he'd sat in himself only that morning. Are you sure? She asked. The police were on their way to her now, Mel said. He called to prepare her, to spare her the shock. He was on his way too. She needed him. She needed friends and family around her. Would she call her children? Did she want Mel to call them? No, she said, and hung up. I'm going to stop there. So, it's been a pleasure to talk with you, Anne. I'm glad we finally got the audio worked out.
Yeah.
And
great fun.
Yeah, and please.
Thank you.
We've got these 2 books on our shelves here in the bookstore, and you can order any of ours through our website online. Any last questions? Anyone? Okay. Thank you all. And I will be sending you the link to the recording of most of this. We missed the very beginning, but anyway, it's been a pleasure. Goodbye all.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Tanya.